The second lesson for this morning comes from the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. But I want to give you a little bit of context before I read this. Chapter 9 is the chapter where we have the conversion of Saul, who eventually gets renamed Paul. It's the famous conversion on the Damascus Road. And some more things happen, and some interesting things happening in the church. And right before this passage, which is about the resurrection of Tabitha, is a passage called the healing of Aeneas. And I want to read that to you as a background for this passage for today. Now, as Peter went here and there among all the believers, he came down also to the saints living in Lydda. Lydda is a town not far from Joppa, where Tabitha is, and it's right on the coast of the Mediterranean. There he found a man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden for 8 years, for he was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed." It's interesting, this latter part of that. I was thinking, that's what my mother said to me every morning. Get up and make your bed. The get up part of this is anastasis, which is the resurrection word. So anytime you have this getting up thing going on in the New Testament, it's almost always that word. So you have these hints to the resurrection, or this is the evidence of the resurrection power. Get up, make your bed. And immediately he got up. He was raised up, resurrected. And all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now we come to the passage for today. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. I'm going to make a point about the fact that she's been named a disciple because only men are named disciples. So this is a big deal here. She was devoted to good works. It's not a very good translation. She was full of good works, is what the Greek says here. She was full of good works and acts of charity and mercy. And at that time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs, and since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay. Come now." So Peter got up. The sense here is he just dropped everything, got up, there's the anastasis word again, and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him weeping and showing tunics and other garments and clothing that Dorcas had made, also known as Tabitha, while she was with them. Peter sent all of them, he put all of them outside because he was going to be alone now, and he knelt down and he prayed. And he turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Anastasis, resurrection. Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. And this became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain man named Simon, who was a tanner. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You just can't keep a good woman down. That's the subject before us today. I worked hard on that title. I think it fits this text. You just can't keep a good woman down. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment you're a part of the pastoral staff, and there's been a death, and you've been asked to go visit with the family. And you go in wondering how much you really know about the person you'll probably be memorializing in a eulogy. There's no way that you can know everything, no way you can know as much about the deceased as friends and family know. So you sit with pen in hand and ready to take notes, and you listen. You say, tell me about your mama. Tell me about your daddy. And little by little, the true story of this person who has died begins to emerge. You laugh and you cry and you look surprised as different members of the family and friends share stories, things no one else knew, secrets from childhood and youth, little idiosyncrasies, a kindness here, a mischief there, a worry and a fear that you had no idea your loved one had. And as a pastor, you listened in silent reflection and then try to gather all of it up in a prayer and go back to your office and write up what you're going to say from your scribbled notes, what you're going to say from a pulpit like this about the one who has died. It's part of the job. Invariably, in the reception afterwards, someone will come up to you and say, oh, that was a beautiful eulogy. And I always reply, well, I had good material to work with, the person who died. And I remind them, you write your own eulogy with the way you live your life, which is a sobering thought in itself. I also remind them to be really nice to your friends and families and your pastor, because they will have the last word. You know that story about the two brothers in a small town, both scoundrels and cheats. Everyone knew that they were scoundrels and cheats. One of them died, and the other brother came to the pastor of a local church and said, Pastor, if you will say that my brother was a saint in the memorial service, I will give you $10,000. Pastor thought for a moment, nodded, agreed, took the money, got in the pulpit, and said, we know that the deceased was a scoundrel and a cheat, but compared to his brother, he was a saint. He did what he said he would do. What are they going to say about you when you're gone? You never know what someone might say about you. And the truth is, you do write your own eulogy with the way you live your life. That's what the woman in this story understood. That's what she did. Tabitha was her name, but she was also called Dorcas. Tabitha in Aramaic means gazelle. Dorcas in Greek means wild goat. So Tabitha, Dorcas, pay your money, take your choice. I wonder which one she preferred. I guess it depended on which crowd she was in. She must have been a remarkable woman. Probably a woman of independent means, a woman of real stature and political power in the early church. There's a reason we know that. It's because the word disciple is rarely ever used for anyone but males. But here, she is named as a disciple. And if you do the research, you will find that the word for disciple here is the feminine version of mathetes, mathetira, and it's only used once in the whole New Testament. And this is when it is used. So we know from that Tabitha was a big deal. When she spoke, people listened. But what's the most important thing about her resume? Well, it's the way she's remembered. Two things: full of good works and acts of charity and mercy. That's it. There's her eulogy right there. Full of good works and lots of acts. She performed lots of acts of charity and mercy. That's the way she will be remembered forever. But how will you be remembered? What will they say about you someday when you die? Last week we honored the seniors in high school, and this Sunday we are honoring our acolytes. So I want to address you all just for a moment. What are they going to say? You're just starting out your lives. What are they going to say about you? You're going to write your own eulogy with the way you're going to live your life from this moment on. Are they going to say, well, you made a lot of money? Some of you may make a lot of money. Or you were famous? Some of you might be famous. But what will be special about you is not the amount of money you make, but what you do with your money and your fame to help those who are in need. What will be special about you will be the idea that you want to make a difference, not just make a buck. And that you understand the difference between success and significance. Now, Tabitha understood that. Tabitha lived in Joppa, which was right on the coast of the Mediterranean, there in Israel and Palestine. And she could have lived the big life on the beach and just enjoyed herself. But instead, she lifted herself up to lift others up who were down and out. And the more she gave and the more she offered of herself, the better she felt. Why? Because that's the way we're made, Imago Dei, to give, to share, particularly with people who are hurting. And the widows there are showing the clothing. You can just picture the scene, the garments, the tunics. It reminds me of our knitting ministry here, where so many women come together every Thursday to make prayer shawls to be taken to those who have lost loved ones. Tabitha was making clothes, probably for people who were poor, probably for people who had no clothes and needed some help. And she was a defender of the defenseless. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Michael Chabon's book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, is a book about comic book characters. And in an interview on PBS, he said the reason that he was so interested in comic book characters is that he found out in his research that back in the 1930s and 1940s, when all these comic book characters were first coming into being in books, they were written mostly by Jewish authors. Because Jewish authors understood what it meant to be weak and defenseless because of centuries of holocausts and pogroms. And so their idea was, if we can put these superheroes out into the world so that the defenseless and the powerless will feel protected, then we need people like Superman and Wonder Woman. Well, Tabitha was a superhero in her time, a heroine who cared more about her own life, who cared less about her own life than she did about others, and she wanted to help those who were in need, and she lifted them up. But then one day, she died, which will happen to all of us. We die physically, or we die on the stage, or we die inside because something was said to us that is so painful, it hurts so deeply, we can't seem to get over it, it depresses us. We die in all kinds of ways in our lives. Some of us get depressed. Some of us despair. Some of us just get stuck and we can't move, like Aeneas in the passage right before the one we just read. Paralyzed, all knotted up. Maybe it's an addiction, I don't know what. It's like the paralytic in Mark 2, where Jesus heals the one who's been brought down through the roof and says, get up, get moving again. Sometimes that's all we need to hear, that resurrection word calling us to break out of our paralysis, whatever it is. I remember when I was teaching at Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, back in the mid-1970s, and I had a student in a preaching class who just froze halfway through his sermon. I don't know if you all ever done this in a speech class, but just froze, you know. And I said, George, you need to keep going. If you're going to be a minister, you have to give a whole sermon. You can't give just... And he just stood there hanging on, his white knuckle grabbing the side of the pulpit. I said, George, you need to keep going and finish your sermon. The whole class was just like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And I began walking softly and quietly up to the pulpit. And I came right up next to him while he just stood there like this. And I whispered, George, if you don't finish your sermon, you will flunk this class, and I will have you kicked out of this school. And it loosened him right up, and he just took off from there, Sometimes you just need someone to say, get up. Come on, let's get moving again. Aeneas was paralyzed, and he got up. Also made his bed. That was I don't know why that's in there. That's sort of interesting scripture. Tabitha wasn't paralyzed, though. Tabitha was dead. Sometimes you feel that way, like you're just dead, and you can't go on. Overwhelmed by whatever it is. There was a woman in a church I served in Richmond whose husband died, and they had no children, and when he died, something died inside her. And she just wasn't sure she could go on. And everyone tried to get her spirits back. She would come to church, she'd sing the hymns, she'd listen to the sermon. She just sat there like a zombie. People would invite her to parties and to dinner, but nothing. Nothing seemed to work. It was like she was dead herself. I remember my old professor, A.B. Rhodes, had gone up to do lectures on Mackinac Island up in Michigan and had a heart attack, and they brought him into the hospital, and they pronounced him dead. And he heard them pronounce him dead. And they said, well, we're going to have to notify the family, and we're going to have to take his body to the morgue. And he heard all of that, but couldn't move. He was stuck. And finally, one of the interns saw his eyes barely moved right after they had said, this one's a goner, and he heard them say, this one's a goner. They said, this one's a goner about Tabitha. And she was. And then something happened. They weren't ready to give up on that or to give up on Tabitha, and they heard Peter was close by, and they sent 2 men to get him, and Peter dropped everything he was doing to go be with them. I remember a woman in a previous church calling me one day, and I dropped everything when she told me that her husband had fallen off the 3-story roof of their house and landed on a wooden stake. And I beat the ambulance there and was talking to him calmly. The ambulance took him off, and Parkland emergency room docs, miracle workers that they are, kicked into gear, and our whole church prayed in a way they had never prayed before. And that man is still alive today, 2 decades later. I don't know how many times I have written a eulogy and ready to give it because someone was near the end and then had to put it back in the file. I had to do that 3 different times across 30 years with my father. Just sure it was the end. But then he came back. He just kept coming back. Get up, Tabitha, says Peter. Get up. And she opens her eyes and sees him, and he gives her his hand and helps her up, because that's what the church does. That's what God does. That's what the community does for those who are in our community ministries program, who need a hand up, for those who are in our Children's Fresh Air Farm, those in our STAIR program, those in First Light. They need a hand up, and we are there to do that. So that woman in Richmond was one that was nearly dead in her own psyche, but they wouldn't give up on her, and they kept hanging in there with her and kept giving her a hand up, and eventually she overcame her grief and her emotional despair and was brought back to life. And old A.B. Rhodes, well, the intern saw his eyes move and says, wait a minute, guys, we're not taking this one to the morgue. And they picked him up and helped him up. Tabitha was one that God never gave up on. You just can't keep a good woman down, or a good man for that matter. I don't care what you're going through. I don't know how painful it is right now. Do not ever think that God will give up on you, or that our community will give up on you. Whatever it is, God is there, represented by one of us holding your hand. Why? Because if God be for you, nothing can be against you. To this God be all honor and blessing and glory and praise from this day forth and forevermore. God bless you all.